then we're going to sort of go walk through some of the information we've covered and try to start to get our hands around recommendations and suggestions. When we finish up today, I'll probably go to a smaller group. Well, we'll see where we are at the end of the day, and then at some point I'll get a smaller group to just put pen to pencil to edit and draw up the recommendations, and then we'll come back to the overall and try to get that done on schedule. So as we look at things today, we'll put key recommendations that we come up with is capital and how much we spend. And then the other recommendations are really framing how the county and the county being the elected officials, as well as the community, looks at what we have to do and looks at what I've said in the past is a new norm. So let's get input from you today. Look at the recommendations from last year and put things into context with the economic outlook that we have. I think there's we're ready.
Are you? Yes. Okay, if all on.
No pressure. Decided to leave after the
He looked in, decided to get something better.
Remember,
Whatever up there looks like. That's what they're doing.
okay?
Yeah, I'll do that. I forgot which switch it was. Yeah.
Are you?
I didn't bring it. I think they're just gonna hit it out. Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm going to just turn it over to you, and only directions we have for you is you've got to be completed by 10/8. So, in the future.
Squared away here. Things on. Good morning. Good morning. I want to talk a little bit about a recommendation or suggestion of ambulance billing. My recommendation is that the county and the FRS not implement ambulance billing. Potentially, you could potentially see, I'm speculating, $2 million revenue from ambulance billing. That is not arguable. What we don't know is what investment we'll have to put into it to see that $2 million revenue. But before I talk about the finances of it, I want to talk a little bit about the value of what the two options would look like. A fire-based fire EMS system versus an ambulance billing model. During the snowstorm, actually shortly after the snowstorm, on Monday, an employee, one of our analysts that works for us, called me and said, my cousin had to drive her husband to the hospital, Howard County General. He was having a heart attack. Upon arrival at the hospital, he was taken directly to the cath lab to bust open some clots. That's her cousin. The cousin works for the fire department. So I'll just say her name is Jane. So Jane, who works for me, asked her cousin, well, why didn't you call the ambulance? Why didn't you call EMS? And her cousin said, because we just moved here and I don't know how much it'll cost. How much it'll cost to get from Elk Ridge to Howard County General. Okay, they're unemployed, and this is a true story. I could not have made it up. The Monday after the snowstorm. So here it is, a family member of the fire department. A family member of the fire department was not aware or sure of how much it cost for a critical call. We ran 56 critical calls that snowstorm, that 72-hour period. I can only imagine how many out there who aren't related to the fire department who have some of that same thought. As much as I've ruminated and thought about this over the last 14 months, I keep landing to the value of what is expected from the Howard County community when they call 911. There are other places that, you know, ambulance billing works really well, okay? I'm not sure it works well here. Most importantly, I'm concerned about the vulnerable populations. It is, in my mind, deductibles, individual deductibles in some of these health plans are somewhere in the $2,500 to $5,000 range for those who have insurance. The vulnerable population may not be able to realize that a $25,000 to $5,000 deductible and expect, and I'm sure the insurance companies will pass down those costs to the individual. I believe that there's some of this misnomer that, you know, my insurance company will pick it up. Potentially after you've met your deductibles. I'm not terribly concerned about those who can afford an ambulance bill. I'm most concerned about the vulnerable population that is growing, and my document that I passed around will help make that point. The eastern side of the county, it is booming, and our EMS call is going up. And you know, I will never know who didn't make it to the hospital because of a misunderstanding. Okay, I'm really focused on the quality and the expectation in Howard County, Maryland. People move here for many reasons: school, law enforcement, our libraries, our parks. And I do a lot of traveling, and they want to move here for public safety just the same as the schools and the libraries and the parks. That can't be lost. We're not, you know, a second-rate system. We're actually probably a model system in the United States, and I want to keep it that way. So, can some money be made with EMS billing? Certainly. Will it be substantial to kind of fix some of our shortfalls? I suspect not. I suspect it will be $1 million or $2 million, and that's just me kind of estimating it.
Chief,
Yes.
couple questions. The fact that someone doesn't know, whether it's, I'm just saying, the devil's advocate, if it's billed or not, they're not gonna know. I mean, I think when we looked at this last year, and the thought was, and the discussion was, there'd be a safety net, regardless of what. It's no different than when I was on the college board, when we raised tuition $1, we made sure there was X percentage of that increase went into scholarships to cover the financial needs. So if there was a safety net in there, because the communication issue is whether there's billing or not. With someone not knowing, and that's a different issue. If the safety net issue was out of the way and people weren't going to be impacted, would that change your perspective?
I want to make sure I understand how you envision a safety net. Let me take a chronic diabetic who's one of our super users, and they make 10 trips to the hospital a year by way of ambulance. I'm trying to understand what the safety net would look like for our super users who probably after trip number 3 or trip number 5 are starting. How far does the safety net go for the 10% of our calls that are safety nets? I mean, our super users. I'm trying to understand.
Well, I think part of it is throwing things out without knowing. I'm not sure whether a deductible applies to emergency care within the system. I haven't looked at my own health system from that standpoint. So I think we need to understand that. Whoever was looking at it needs to understand whether because there are certain types of care within healthcare that deductibles don't apply. And so I'm not sure. So I think we have to understand that. And I think the question would be whether it was worthwhile for the county to look at this on a holistically versus what are the issues, look at all the issues operating and otherwise, and see, does it make sense at the end of the day without impacting people relative to their care? Because I don't think that's
I am absolutely not opposed to exploring it, to looking at models. I'm at this point not advocating an implementation, but discovery of it, exploration, research, absolutely, absolutely. I'd be lying to say it doesn't work. It doesn't work in America, that's not true. It works in some places. This is the only fire department I've been in, and this is the only county I've lived in since 1980. And there's some intangibles and immeasurables that I don't want to see erode, but that's another whole philosophical perspective. You know,
Chief, I think one of the concerns is that we are foregoing revenue opportunities because the insurer will pay for it. So we are in essence subsidizing the insurer at this point. So
we have to do our homework. We have to do our
And
homework.
by the way, so as we looked at this, it's the hospital rates are set regionally.
Yes.
So we looked as, in fact, we're subsidizing Prince George's County, Montgomery County, all our surrounding counties, because as the rates are set, we're basically, our costs aren't going in, so we're actually helping them, which is okay, but it doesn't, if you can do it. And I think the key here is when we say implement, maybe the recommendation we make, but it needs to be studied, because right now, we don't have that detail, and you don't have that detail,
Right.
so we're all talking over each other from that standpoint.
I think that's a very important point. I prepared to come and argue against an implementation, not to argue against
So
research.
I would just like to say that I think it would be great for us to do a study, but there's nobody at this table that's low income that can speak from the chief's point of view. And I think one of the things that sometimes happens in these conversations is that we don't have that voice at the table. So my thought is I'd love to have the study. I think a good debate and really look at all the issues, but I'd really like to see on that group somebody with another voice than just this group.
Chief, I'm wondering if you can speak to what the population of ambulance calls are. One of the things that I have heard, just sort of talking to people who, work at, Howard County General and other places, is that there's a tremendous number of people who are coming in from some of the assisted living and other facilities that should probably be not calling 911 and should be probably using private ambulance services, but because we don't charge for ambulance services in this county, there's a use of those services. Is that a lot, or the super users who are going 10 times, and how much of it is somebody who's very medically fragile, and how much of that is somebody who doesn't have transportation? And so, or general health care. So I might call my pediatrician if my kid has a 104-degree fever, but somebody who doesn't have a car, to Barbara's point, doesn't have a car, doesn't have that sort of safety net, is going to call 911 or something instead. Do you have an idea of what that is?
Numerically, statistically, I can't skew it, but from a portrait of it, we triage our calls, as you can imagine, based on what the determinant is when they call 911. We don't triage on the 911 end, we triage when we put hands on the patient. And 99% of the time, I'm just using a number, we are treating a patient who needs medical attention. Now, on the converse, or the consequent side of that, after care has been established and the patient is transferred, and we realize that this, this could have been handled another way, we usually work with the hospital and the skilled nursing facility to talk about, look, here's another network that could work. Did Mrs. Smith have a high fever or altered mental status? Absolutely. But she has altered mental status 20 days of the 30 days. So maybe there are other systems as opposed to taking her directly to the emergency room. So what I'm saying is, what you've heard has a whole lot of truth to it, but we don't get in the unit, turn the lights on, and think we're going down to Lorien.
You can't.
You can't. And many places and many systems start there. You know, we're going to Lorient, so turn the lights off, or, you know, there are many places around that's contiguous to us that take a whole different approach to this. Yeah, so,
So, if you were to characterize your concerns, and I know that the issue of barrier to entry, fair use of service is a broad topic, but just for completeness, is that do you have concerns about implementation of that fall outside of that sort of general classification? I mean, that under, I mean, I think that underserved populations or something would use the service less, or is that it, or is there more of it?
that's the big umbrella, that, this could potentially be a barrier to healthcare.
So if I ask the question a different way, if we were, for the sake of discussion, able to remove that as a barrier, you wouldn't have any objection to it?
I wouldn't have any objection to researching and looking into it. John?
Oh, I mean implementing.
So there are a couple other issues though. One of them is the Affordable Care Act is going to change how the reimbursements are made. Now, we all have an expectation that there's still going to have to be reimbursements in some way. But what that means to us is that looking historically at what the potential revenue is might not be a good predictor of what we look at in the future. Because the reimbursement is not going to be per mile, per trip, like an Uber ride. It's going to be patient feedback surveys and how many times did that person go. It's going to be much more integrated with the total care of the patient, even at the hospital. So the hospital actually has an interest in EMS transport, because if we transport lots of people there, they get less too. You know, so what that means to us is looking at the previous models of what could be out there to collect might not be totally accurate. There's going to have to be some, you know, payment for it. So it's not like we're worried that's going to go away. It just makes it a little bit more iffy as to what that's going to be.
Which touches, I think, the point that if they go to that sort of holistic care model, that will not only be subsidizing Montgomery County, but will be subsidizing Howard County in general, and Hopkins doesn't that help.
See, when you say we're going to be subsidizing, I understand the argument there, but I don't necessarily agree with kind of the getting that intellectual leap from essentially having a subscription service versus a fee-for-use service. I mean, we have a fire tax, it's a subscription service. You subscribe, you get the service if you need it. If you don't, then you count your blessings, you didn't need it. The fee-for-service model, which would, you know, you end up billing an insurance company where the trend is, without question, pass it on to the consumer. What's going on now with deductibles. You asked a question about what applies as far as copayment and deductibles. Varies a lot by insurance company. Medicare, you pay 20% plus a deductible for an ambulance ride. Other insurance companies have it, you might just pay a copayment, you might not pay a copayment, but you pay a deductible. But without question, the trend is you're paying more for that. And I think we all see that in our healthcare plans. The deductibles are going up, the copays are going up. That is an industry strategy as they kind of concentrate and also as they deal with their return on investment from their investment side of things.
One thing does make county different from a lot of other counties is we have a designated fire tax. It's 17.6 cents on that. For average taxpayers, when you look at the property tax bill, there's a 1.014 county tax, but then on top of that, there's a 17.6 cents. So that makes the total combined tax actually at the high end among all the counties here. So it's kind of might be a little difficult to, when you explain this to taxpayers, say we already tax you for tax, but then we charge another fee on top of that. And I don't think other counties charge you that.
But again, my point is, there's a revenue opportunity from an insurance carrier that is not being billed. And to the extent that that can be investigated and billed and collected, the county is silly not to take advantage of a system that's there to subsidize and pay for that service. Now, to the chief's point, when you've got an underserved population, and Barbara's point, they can't afford that, we need to make sure that there is a safety net so those folks aren't burdened or don't use the service because they feel like they've got a financial.
Larry, last comment.
Quick question, Chief, when you started your comments, I understood what you were talking about anecdotally with regard to the concern about folks maybe hesitating to adopt the cost. But you said you also weren't sure about the cost to implement a program such as this. What costs were you referring to?
Well, most often, there's a billing company, a third service, a collection
So
company.
it's an implementation, it's just asking for a, isn't that sort of part of,
It's a return on investment analysis.
There is cost of collection, and I don't know if this speaks pro or con of the issue, but Chief, you're speaking to a third-party contractor. In all likelihood, the cost of collection falls to the Department of Finance, the Office of Law.
I forgot about it. Yeah.
We can certainly bill insurance companies on a kind of procedural basis without a whole lot of effort. But what we have to deal with are those people who either underinsured or do not have insurance. And the pursuit of those folks, including the law department does a good job in terms of collections and pursuit this way. Is the juice worth the squeeze?
Absolutely.
Now, I think for that group of people, on the other hand, the procedural billings would be a revenue source. We do that pretty straightforward and functionally. But for those people not insured or underinsured, we get to the point, there's almost a reluctance to pursue an aggressive collection policy against a person who doesn't have the money. And
Yeah, I think we've got it all. That's a business decision, and it's also relevant, gets to the safety net as to whether you would do it or not. So I think this is, first of all, thank you for coming, a great discussion, which is what we're trying to do in this group, is to create conversations. And what I'm hearing, if a recommendation to come forward, it's really to create a study to see if it can work. And you've got, I'm thinking, the type of people we can talk about. The hospital probably needs to be represented on that, citizen services, fire department,
financial law.
finance, and it's a number, to see what are the issues, because I always look at, when you're trying to do, what's an operating issue versus, and I'm hearing on operating issues that are important because they're dealing with people, but if you can overcome those, and then look at what's, at that point, the revenue against cost, you say, what's the return on investment? And if you could make all those things go away,
Sure.
and it was $1 million or $1.5 million net to the county,
Sure.
that's $1 million or $1.5 million
Ignore it.
net
Can't
that
ignore
could be spent to serve citizens. So I think you just have to, without a conclusion to it, you've got to go through the process, otherwise we can sit around here, and I agree with Barbara, you need to have the right people at the table. We can sit around here and intellectually talk about it, but we need to get down to the detail. Okay?
Hey, by law, ambulance.
what
No,
percentage
one.
Zero.
Yeah, one.
if the fire, what percentage of fire department costs are paid by the fire tax? All, most?
No, yeah.
Yeah.
Just as a 90,
99%.
is it then a source of revenue? If we're charging fee for service on something we're collecting for fire tax, wouldn't we then, by, justice, need to rebate that, reduce the fire tax? It would be a tax reduction.
I don't think so. I mean, the reality is, if you look into the fire tax, we have a long discussion on the fire tax and how that fits into the property. It's used for capital, it's used for, for equipment, it's used to help finance fire stations. And it has its own history in terms of why it is and where it is right now. And I think that's a slippery slope. It's an issue relative to communicating to citizens. But on anything that we do, the largest recommendation that we can make that they want to listen to is to have a conversation with the citizens and talk to them and giving them information so they can understand and make. I think most of the citizens in Howard County will make the right decisions if they understand what you're talking about. It's just that if we want to throw a bunch of sound bites at them, they won't. They'll go and vote like we do in some of the elections. Okay? So we'll try to do the latter and make this more substantive and get people thinking and talking about it. Okay? Thank you, Chief. Appreciate it. Okay. Now I'm going to, talk about the fiscal outlook and really get to, there's financial numbers and there's other recommendations on the process that'll come out of this committee. And probably the two that people look at the most are our spending recommendation in terms of budget, not where it's spending, but the spending recommendation, and secondly, the capital and the impact of the capital on future expenses against revenues.
The presentation materials ended up here, so if anybody came in and needs a copy, please.
I'll go for just like an update of the current county fiscal outlook, and after that, our colleagues in finance will talk about debt affordability, which is another major assignment of the committee, look at the county's debt status on debt affordability. Fiscal outlook, first start by looking at the county's general fund revenue history and including 2 years outlook on that. If you just look at the pattern, we're doing incremental growth for most years. It's been slowed down a little bit, and now we're still at the moderate growth stage. That's the way I want to describe that. And one thing to share with the group is I came back from a revenue round table from DC last week. In the round table, there are folks from federal CDO, there's folks from Federal Reserve, from Virginia State, Maryland State, several other cities and counties in the region. And the wording they used to describe their current fiscal and future fiscal outlook is steady and slow, moderate, mild, modest. I heard that wording a lot. In general, the sentiment is that, yes, we are seeing recovery, and not too many people are very concerned about another recession anytime in the near term, although this always exists. But the overall sentiment is that we are not looking at a quick recovery to somewhere historically high growth area. So in general, people are saying they're preparing for a new norm is kind of a moderate growth. In our county, that's I normally look at as 3-point some percentage, and it's likely to be the situation for the next couple of years, not just in the immediate fiscal year. So this is the county's revenue and percentage growth, but I extracted the non-revenue revenues. You could say the first 5 years, you can see that it has been trending down. So it has been slowing down until fiscal year 2015. We all know that's a year that county experienced a major difficulty, and during the mid-year, we anticipated 15.8 million revenue shortfall, and we took very quick actions and get cooperation from all agencies very diligently to come up with and execute a savings plan. We end up closing the year not in deficit, thanks to everybody's effort, but it's not without pain. So FY 2015, you see the revenue growth slow down significantly. Now looking at 16-17, we're seeing that actually at least part of the situation in FY 13 was temporary, related to the reconciliation that's related to fiscal cliff a couple of years ago. But also a portion of that is probably going to the base. It's related to the federal spending slowing down. No longer sequestration, but still we see some slowdown in spending. So going forward, 16-17, we see the situation improving, but not close to the historical high level. And another thing to point it out is, while we see things likely to improve as a moderate recovery, the percentage here wouldn't tie directly with the budget, because if we look at the actual 17 budget compared to 16 budget, the growth is not going to be that high, because FY 16, we actually were lucky. We had some one-time revenue gains from property sales. It's, at that point was estimated by $45 million there, and that's getting to this 16 budget. So when you actually see 17 number compared to 16 budget, it's not going to be that high. It's probably 3.2% at this point. As we already saw this graph before, this county is primarily general fund revenue relying on 2 critical sources: is property tax and income tax. They combined actually consist of more than 90% of total revenue. So that's why throughout this presentation, that will be the focus of our discussion. They are the drivers of revenue picture. Property tax, this is a multi-year history and trend. On the property tax, we are seeing, or we have been experiencing recovery from years ago when we have the housing bubble recession at that point. However, as you can observe, the recovery speed is very steady, but relatively slow. And actually, if you look at 15, 16, 17, we are in the area between 3.2% to 3.8% in general. And FY16 actual number is slightly better than the original SDAT estimate, so which is good news for FY16. But for 2017, based on the recent data we got from SDAT, actually the number is likely to slow down further because the new group just get reassessed is only showing 9% for 3 years, which is average 3% a year, versus the last group that reassessed was 3.5%. So that actually get kicking into the base, and we'll explain that in a couple minutes. This is giving an even longer history to show the trend. What's on the top showing both the gross and the net base. The gross base is more reflection of market base. The net assessed base is the taxable base, because for owner-occupied property, as you all know, we have homestead tax credits cap the gross at 5% in this county here. So when during the good years and the market growth is off the roof there, your tax bill only grow by 5% at maximum. So but at a given time, those two lines actually getting closer and closer now. So now the market assessment versus the true taxable base is very close now. So the chart at the bottom was showing the actual annual percentage change for gross base and net base there. What we can see is the last several years here, we have recovered from the lowest level. However, nothing compared to what was experienced in the 2000s period of time. At that point, we had very low number. Now things are recovering, but still we're talking 3% a year, and that's our number one revenue source for the county. As we just talked about the assessment growth, each county 1/4 of the property will be assessed by the state, and that's the key driver of assessable base growth. We have to focus on that, and that would slow down from the prior growth. The county also continues to see homestead tax credit, which means we have less and less revenue unrealized, which is a positive thing. However, that once the tax credit almost down, then we no longer going to get any either cushion or gains from that credit. New constructions, cumulatively only adding very small piece to the county's property tax base, because the county also have a policy conscientiously educate public facility. Yeah, and that actually was trying to make sure that we control and manage the growth of the county for long-term sustainability, because all the growth has costs associated, people yield, and other needs on that. So new construction at this point is a very small add to the overall assessment base. This is just the map. The one that's just getting reassessed is group one, which is on the very top in the red color. How do we compare it to other counties in terms of reassessment? Okay, so for 2015 and 2016, the number is, as we just talked about, the recent one is 9%. If you look at the comparison between the county and the state average, we actually have been lagging behind the state average for 2 years in a row, but in particular for the group one, which is the base for fiscal year 2017. So that is not a great story there, but there is some reason to believe to the fact that last time when this group got reassessed 3 years ago, we actually did better than the rest of the state. So that group, if you look at 2013, at that point Howard County was still managed to have a growth of 2.5%, and that's due to the recession time. Most other counties you can see have negative growth at that point. So the county performed relatively well at that point. As a result, when other counties come back significantly from the historical low period of time, we only see kind of, not as strong growth there. So that's probably attributable to that there. So in other words, our economy has been relatively stable. we're not that volatile. But if you talk about year-to-year growth for budget purposes, we're not like some other counties suddenly see money coming back. Another thing interesting, I think I touched upon that last time, is about residential versus commercial. On the residential, both the county and the state, you can see the single-digit growth currently. But if you look at the commercial, the county and the state has been experiencing double-digit growth for multiple years, for commercial reassessment. And actually that's true around this region, not only in Maryland, but also some other county and cities in this area. In general, the data and other reports tend to show that commercial base has been a stronger driver in terms of percentage growth there. So we touched upon a little bit last time in our presentation about, the county probably should continue its policy of encouraging commercial-based growth because that seems to be very promising in terms of adding to the county's taxable base there. And here's the county's history in terms of residential versus commercial. Back to 2010, the county's commercial base was 14.3% throughout the years. That percentage has experienced some growth. As of now, it's 16.9%. So the trend was encouraging, but because commercial overall is still a relatively small piece, so each year its contribution to your overall assessed base is still limited. But that's the area that we do need to continue to pay more attention to drive the future revenue base.
I'm sorry, how does that compare to our neighboring counties, the residential versus commercial assessment base metrics? Are we average, below?
I need to get the data there, but yeah.
Would imagine it.
Yeah, I think we used to be average, but I don't know today, because other counties also have been experiencing.
One other quick question, with regard to downtown, if you look out 5 years,
Might be different.
what would, Larry, what would that number, you think, what kind of gross TIV are we gonna, or
Yeah, it's really good to know how fast they build, but I mean, it's, we can model it.
but relative to impact of the county in terms of tax base, will it be significant or will it be drop?
Yeah, absolutely, gonna add to it. It's, we keep talking about trying to get to 20%. I mean, that's a
That's a huge
huge jump. I mean, to get there, when you consider our average absorption is about, maybe 800 to 1 million square feet a year across categories. To get to 20%, it's in the millions of square feet.
So really, the absorption is gonna hold, more than what they can build or zoning, it's really gonna be what's the absorption, which is we don't control.
Yeah, because the absorption drives the construction drives the base. So, and I mean, the other piece about commercial assessment is the way they assess it, right? Because it's based on what rents are, occupancy and things like that. So it's not just having a building, it's having a full building and charging market rate.
Some period.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
And, yeah, I'll find out more information and share what they would think about the comparison of the other counties. And that's a really good question. Okay, the next big revenue is income tax. Again, I mean, look at the past couple of years or see how we dropped significantly in fiscal 2015, barely had any growth on that year. And look at our 16 and 17, we're seeing things coming back to some extent there. So at this point, we're projecting for both year close to 4% or in that magnitude, which is not as good as the historical level, but that's based on our best information received at this point and our reading of the economy. Talking about economy, here are a couple of charts I borrowed from French's reports. And last time, because of time limit, he shared some information, but I'm not able to share with all of you all his nice table graphs. So we're using some of this here in terms of unemployment rate. This real line shows that Howard County, which is in the green line, we are still doing better, which is really a good sign. We're still doing better than Maryland or United States. However, the gap between the three is getting closer and closer. You all probably read from the newspaper over the weekend. The United States unemployment dropped to very low level that we tested.
I thought it was
Have
gonna happen.
located on that there. At that point, however, the worries about the job growth appears to be slowed down, even wage growth, we see some growth on that, and there's the Wall Street Journal's article about the job growth might be, looks like it's weakening on that there. So the next slide is talk about employment growth. This is the one last year, if you look here, that's the one actually concerned us a lot. The green line is the county. The job growth actually has been falling behind both Maryland and the United States for 2 years in a row now. And historically, you can see for most part of we were actually performing better than both the state and the national economy. And that's a part that we spent some time discussing about it last time there, and that's our major concerns on that, because for this county, even average wealth is also good. It's mostly made up not billionaires, but the high-level professional folks there, well-educated professionals there. So the job growth there, the company, it does kind of make a difference there. The annual employment growth, this is the data that actually drill down a little further. The red color represents Howard County. This is showing year-to-year percentage growth compared to other major counties and also Maryland. Maryland was represented in the navy color there. What is alarming is, again, we have been doing better than most of our peers in this region for a while, until 2013 and 2014. And you can see that Maryland average in these 2 years has 0.8%, which is still slow, but some growth there. And for the county, it was actually shrinking to 0.26 and 0.34% there. So the job growth did slow down. Some of them could be related to federal sequestration, federal spending, but even that factor improved. How much it will improve and whether that's going to start becoming a driver rather than a drag very soon, I guess that's still quite some uncertainty there. And in this region, because of our geographic location, federal government jobs do directly, or federal spending, I should say, do directly, indirectly impact our job and wage growth there.
Is part of that how much more we can leverage out of cyber versus other industries or other specialties to bring into the county? Do we feel like we've maxed out, Larry, on the cyber tech growth, and we have to turn?
No, I'd say we're just getting warmed up. I mean, the trend is we're seeing a lot of the government, subcontracting events, cyber turning more towards commercial.
Okay, which makes sense.
We're seeing smaller subcontractors who have been solely, defense related, are now turning more towards commercial.
So from your perspective, from economic development, job growth, is it absorption? From your lens, where is it? Why is it slow down?
Cyber?
No, not slow, just overall job growth relative to economic development. Is it some global thing, or is it a pure absorption of space, and is it places?
I mean, I'd say it's a mix of things. We've missed some opportunities because we haven't had product on the shelf to sell, because spec development came to a standstill, and, you know, there might be space, but it might not be in the big chunks that some folks are looking for. So, you know, trying to find a 40 or 50,000 square foot piece of space, it's hard to find.
So,
I
and hard
mean,
to
that's,
finance.
yeah, well, exactly. That's why it's not getting built, because that whole market is completely changed, and there is only a few select developers who are willing to, you know, who can and will do it speculatively. So, I mean, that has changed the dynamic a little bit. Old stories, no, but
On cyber, I mean, Obama's budget, which is in fact at an arrival, does have $25 billion more for cyber, and specifically targets NSA for the bulk of the increase. And second, in terms of the composition of growth, one of the things that is part of the reason is government employment growth ramped up in the last 2 years. We don't have a lot of federal employment growth. We don't have a lot of federal employees working in Howard County. We have a lot of federal employees commuting, but not in the county. Also, I think a lot of the growth has been in state and local as well, where, you know, in the past, we've been, because our budget wasn't as bad as neighboring jurisdictions, we haven't had the suppressed hiring at the state and local level, or I guess the local level, that you saw in other counties. So part of that doesn't explain all of the difference, but it is a reasonable part of the difference. When you look at private sector employment growth in the last year, we were about the state average, slightly under. So government is a role in this. The recovery in government is one of the reasons we've dropped down.
Okay, thank you.
And this is also a gap that contrasts some of that, is that this on the very top is just like things tied to platinum unemployment, very little growth, but with some of the components, the part is more of the business.
This is the scary stuff.
So, yeah, professional service, business service, and management company, that type of job, high-paid job, traditionally are one of our most strongest growth area, that has been actually seen a decrease for tourism now. And as the time has come, we do need to find a way to diversify our base. So talk about the income growth there, again, blue color represent Orange County. Good news is 2014, all of us, county, Maryland, and the United States, see some recovery from 2013. 2013 was really, time was really not good. So we had some recovery, but still, it's kind of moderate recovery compared to historical kind of level on that. And another thing is we were still behind the national average. We really are tracking Maryland and slightly better than Maryland in 2014. This is the personal income history and the projection. Again, the crunch is last time on that. If you look at the percentage group with a heading called county PI growth, that county personal income growth history, what I want to point out is that between 2007 and the 2014, which is the last 8 years, the county's general personal income growth, there's up and down, but there's only 1 year above 4.7% growth. If you look at a forecast for the next 6 years from that, we're seeing a trend of recovery, which Dr. Clinch and I are in agreement. We do think we're seeing things improving, but how fast and to what extent, that's where we're debating, because I still feel like a little bit on the hand when we say we will quickly start to see some years, above 5% very quickly, because, in the last 8 years, in one incident, we were above on that. Are we quickly get to historical high level in the next couple of years? I mean, we might, but on the revenue side, I might not bet on that.
But in the last 8 years, we haven't had an unemployment rate that we're heading towards right now to create wage growth. So we've had growth of reasonable numbers in the last couple of years, other than 13, without any real pressure from the job market. I mean, is that where you're getting it from?
Wages accelerated, even though the monthly job figures in January were lackluster, wage growth started to occur, and wage growth was forecast to occur by Moody's, by everybody, even by the Board of Revenue Estimates, which has been issuing these very pessimistic things. And so I think the issue is that when wage growth occurs, and nobody's been good at predicting it, me or anybody else. The question is, when does it occur? And the general consensus, and I even quote Moody's in the report, is that this is the year we're going to see wage growth. Not exceptional, but growth.
But what it tells you is
That
we can't control this, but what can we control is the growth of spending, and it doesn't have to be anywhere near this.
Yes.
Does this, I don't know how to ask this question, does this include zero if you're unemployed, or are they not in the denominator here? Does that question make sense?
Personal income is the income levels of the county residents. If you have none, you have no income. So personal income, it includes.
So unemployment's only important insofar as it drives income?
It drives
it's not
employment growth.
because they have a job and now they have income?
Correct.
Okay.
So job growth, and in fact, job growth in county, it only drives county personal income growth to the extent those jobs are filled by county residents, because personal income is mostly driven by your residential base. the way it's calculated is very different, and I'll bore everybody offline if possible, right? Anybody who wants to hear it, I'll talk about, but nobody wants to hear it now.
So the challenge for us would be what is our pick and
I'm always
find out how much insurance you want to put into that.
I think we all agree that things should be better. It should be better than just how fast and to what extent on that. Because we are seeing job growth still kind of like weak, it's growing. But wage growth, I agree that it should be improving, so those combined together.
I have my
Four
review tomorrow.
point some percentage in near future essentially.
Steve will let us know.
Beyond that, I may not come out right away. Might be down the road. And we just talk about what drives income taxes, primarily personal income growth. I mean, this county, as you know, a lot of counties are from wage only, so that job growth and instead. Capital gains, that's at this point is still a very small component, but very volatile because so when the stock market makes a huge difference, it's still going to get reflected in the personal in the income tax data. At this point, it's a very small percentage. But think about it, even if it's I think it's at this point. Capital gains about 3%, and then you have dividend interest around 2% per year. And even that is small, but if you have like, it's not really 20% change of that, and it's damage or gain to the overall income tax, could still be a half a percentage point or, 0.8% on that. So that's, it's very hard to predict because it was very funny because we talk about that at the revenue roundtable, everybody's laughing to say no matter what you put there, it's guarantee you'll be round either, but the thing is you will be either round by 20% up or 20% down.
Let me ask you a question relative to December for your clients as a whole, from a capital gain standpoint in terms of either taking losses or taking profits. How is it in 2015 versus what you typically see?
Well, I'll take it out of the realm of our personal firm, because that would be fair, but in the.
I wouldn't ask for specific clients.
But no, in general, 2015 was a muted capital gain tax year, either due to management of losses to offset gains, or the fact that the year was a muted investment year. So if that continues in 2016, just as Holly said, you wouldn't see a big surprise on the positive side for our revenue gathering here in the county through capital gains tax realization. The only time you probably see any movement of that needle would have to be tremendous number of business sales or property sales. It won't, I mean, my opinion is long term, it won't come from regular investment accounts as they mutate to qualified plan accounts, IRA accounts, Roth accounts. As they mutate over long term, there's less and less regular investment accounts where you have transactional gains. Secondly, the no yield environment that's been going on for too long, hurting seniors, that reduces investment income and investment and taxation on investments. So, as Holly said, I think the impact of the gain side is small, and the 20% swing either way will be smaller and smaller and smaller. It just won't help us a lot.
Yeah, I'm just thinking something you said the other week with, in terms of your client basis at my age, it's a demographic issue. More older people are going more into tax, basically tax neutral from a standpoint of investment.
Yeah, the only recovery would be forced R&Ds in the future of an aging population, force money out. And part of the, as somebody mentioned, as part of the new proposal, they're looking at R&Ds on Roth accounts. Not, it's age, there's an age selection that wouldn't be susceptible to that. So that would not tax the money coming out, but would just force the money coming out that would then go into our regular bank accounts that we didn't tax.
Yes.
But that's so slow.
But they get no interest anyway.
Yeah, right, no, so it's such a long game.
Okay.
Sorry for you.
No, that's very helpful.
Holly, what's the lag between capital gains when realized by the individual and realized by the county, taxed by the county? It's like a 2 to 3 year lag, right? So in 2015, we're seeing what happened in the market in 2012, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's, in general, you see,
1 to 2 years lag.
1 to 2 years.
For any things there. This year we just talk about it comes essentially third bullets about the lagging impact on that. There are multiple factors. Capital gains itself, there when people realize it, report it, and then when the state distribute also is when the state distributes all the counties there, they don't know during that year, number one, how much. Number two is they don't know how much belongs to individual counties here. So they base the information they collect at that point, and then use a prior calendar tax year's county portion as a guess, and then the second year, then they will make a reconciliation. So typically lag by one, and then another year you have reconciliation, because if they're over distributed or under distributed, then they give you less or more in the following year. So it's always a catch-all situation there. That's why if you look at individual income tax year, it's not a kind of reflection of that year's tax, tax bill on that. So one evidence is the 2013. You see that personal income kind of have minimum growth that year, but when it reflected county income tax is fiscal year 2015, we see the big hit at that point on that. So it's almost fiscal year is different. So it's like one and a half year on average. Try to make this possible. The other element is the win case. The update we got from the state is that based on all the claims they have processed so far historically, they already approved about 3.5 million really to this county's residents on that. Those are one-time historical claims going back several years on that. And going forward, and that's not the end of it. They acknowledge there is still quite some backlog, and they cannot give you a percentage of how much is still in the backlog. They just say they're continuing to process on that. And on top of that, because people are aware of that and file the claims on that there, and in their annual applications there, again, the data is a little bit murky at this point, but based on communication with the state, we think it's probably between 700,000 to 1.5 million per year at this point, and that's just a common loss.
That 3.5 million, when will that hit?
Okay, the state have arrangement that the state will pay upfront, and then the county has the choice. You can either pay them back right away, by 17, or you can pay in 9 quarterly distributions here, which is spread out in 2 years, the amount back to the state. So it's likely to get reflected in both 17 and 18. Not likely in 16 for historical.
What would be helpful to us, and it won't be a large amount, but if you take that, however the county might do, even if you spread out that plus the additional somewhere between 700 and 1,500,000, what does that mean relative to our increase?
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to point out is the county did take a prudent approach. Yes, and not many counties, but some counties have already done that, because at the end of fiscal year 2015, when we closed the year there, we dedicated $3 million there, because that's the data state gave us at that point, and that number changes every time. So that's already reserved from the fund balance to deal with this historical liability. So at least 3 out of 3.9 million, we could use the set aside reserve to do.
So we're only going to be annual impact that we're really looking at.
We're reserved 3 times, we'll probably be built instead of an installation, which I don't know, per year.
Yes, the ongoing is on that. Yes, correct. And also there, at this point, not to complicate that, but at this point, there are some case pending regarding the interest related to for the main case, and if the county sees that, then that will be more costly. Okay.
You say an ongoing loss in the future. I struggle to understand that. It's just money.
Unrealized.
It's just
It's
money
not
that,
really lost, it's just unrealized.
that we didn't earn and never realized, and there's a lot of things we're not earning, not realizing. So I don't know what you do with that number. It's just,
In some way, it would mute our increase. because what all the
Which
accountants.
otherwise will be growth and will be gone.
Right, I mean, after the case is settled, it no longer exists.
Right.
So it's not a,
Getting the base.
it could be 20 million, but it's just not there. So,
We'll see it reflected in further, in future actually.
It's more in context for prior estimates or projected income, that the fact that they might have based it on where historically we were, now that that base has changed, we're gonna see lower estimates as we move forward, but it's, I agree with you.
Doesn't have a lot to.
It's not a.
I don't want to be late for this, but how do we know what the limitations on the liability are gonna be? if-
No.
We don't, it's currently in litigation, it's currently,
But even if it's decided, you still haven't, you have to wait out the statute of limitations on refiling until whenever the, I have no idea what the
The
details.
3 5 is an estimate based on historical trends, but you're right, and you're,
I can't be right because I'm asking a question.
You asked the right question.
it was a rhetorical question. But no, it's still just based on history, we're gonna wait and see, have to wait to see what claims are moved there.
But there are still issues around it that are yet to be resolved that could drastically impact the amount of money that has to be paid out.
Effectively, it'll impact future projections. as we move on. Okay.
So does this one.
Okay, this graph also got found, mentioned that there. It's talk about the county housing market, because it does, it has limited impact on revenue, but it does have some impact on regulation tax, and also tax on that there. This one in general is positive. The red line is inventory has been dropping, you can see for years now, so it actually, and also the days on the market are also, it's not shown here, but also it's less compared to a few years ago. In terms of the transactions, which is the units sold at the very end, that's the blue line there. It's relatively stable, but tickle up a little bit, if you can see that. So last year, 2015, actually we were seeing more active housing sales. Although price is still relatively stable compared to prior year. I think we have slightly less than 2% growth there, which is still doing good because some other counties in Montgomery and around the county, they have either flat or even slightly decreasing prices there. So we got some mixed signs in general. This housing is getting more active, but we haven't seen that price getting cut yet there. So in general, it seems to show improvement there. It's just so far to reflect the revenue, you see a little bit of gains there, but not that significant. State aid, just give you an update about based on the governor's proposal. In general, it's good news. As you know, last year the state cut back quite some compared to the statutory level. So the county as a whole at that point, I think, only experienced 2.4%. This year, the state aid covered the county is $336.7 million. On the operating side here, it's $18 million, increased 5.7% from last year. So it's also better than the state average. So that's better than last year. So that's good news. The majority of them, as you all know, that's not. It's mostly for education entities. That's not a part of the county general fund. So they provide some waiting relief for education entities here, and that's gross is about 16.7 million or 5.0%. And my understanding is what comes from the school system is the state aid to the school system is for 1 million higher than the original.
Yeah, the original
projection.
estimate, from the original estimate, the new readjusted figures, because it's all based on September 30th enrollment. Okay, so that's how the formula is based, so then they readjust them. So, yeah, we're actually about $1 million higher.
Right. So the state aid to the school system is about 4.9% increase. If we exclude the piece that they counted as grants, the state grants, it's just to talk to the general fund, order of it like 4.5%.
Because the grants are mostly pass-through, so that's reported, but the formula is about.
So to summarize here, over the town property tax, income tax, the rest of the counties is just, relatively small in scale in general on that there. So based on year-to-date data and as well as last year's actual and the new information we got from state, from the market and fiscal year 2016, the good news is that the general fund revenue appears to be likely to exceed the original budget, and finally, it's a little property tax income tax by roughly $5 million on that based on the projections here, which is a good news. FY 2017 project revenues are about 32 to 32.7 million higher, it's about 3.2% higher than last year's budget, which is also an upward adjustment from a few months ago, based on the year-to-date information. So again, this is not, so the assessment, my own assessment for that picture, I mean, we're still fine-tuning number whenever we have new information, but the general picture, I think, is still relatively clear. If you look at FY 17, it's not as bad as last year. At that point, we had minimal growth. 15, 16, we had very little growth in that. But then compared to historical level, we're nowhere near where we would want to be. So 3-point-some percentage. That's something I think we should try to find a way to live with. Go ahead, question?
Just, I mean, it's one small item, but why is there a 33% growth in fines and forfeitures from 15 to 16 and then back down 33% next year?
I need to check what's in our approved budget on that there, but in general, that we would make future years projection and estimate in line with historical level and year-to-date. But let me check. You're talking about how does it compare to the approved?
Well, just why is there a spike for 16 and then back to looks like a normal level for?
Yeah. Oh, you know what?
No. Fines and forfeitures is 3.1 and audited for FY 15. And 4.1 and 16. And there's an estimate of 3.1 and the projected 3.2. Just.
Yeah. There's one that was some delinquent tax was captured there. I would check to see what is just the grouping issue. Maybe that should be pulled to another group now. So
okay, and then obviously the next thing is our interest in property sales goes from
that's the one that
600,000 to 10.
That one was interest on property sales. Interest doesn't really change that much at all. It's really property sales. If we just talk about FY 16, there's a one-time property sales. There's a 5.5 million one-time sales, and yeah. No, that's 5.5 is a different property. But then there's another 4 million sales. That's another 4 million sales there. So it's total 9.5. The other 4 million sales is to be sold to me because originally we already purchased those buildings and don't plan to use it for public spend after. So those are 9.5 million until, and that's on top of that FY 16 budget because we don't really have that revenue, but that year we have some one-time. So
You were talking, it's really a new norm. I think what we're looking at in this is what we've been talking about for 2 years, is the new norm of muted revenue increases, but we have an addiction to spending for good reason, I mean, for good things and all, but we've been spending at a much higher clip annually than our revenues are growing. And that's where that's a challenge for the elected officials to deal with whatever we recommend, because we can't sustain that unless we want to increase taxes.
yeah, I mean, as we just talk about, I mean, 3-point-some% growth is really not bad at all. If you look around in Maryland, in this region, or in the nation, it's probably what's most restriction, both here as a fair healthcare, but there's still a lot of needs on that. Represent here. Some are just mandates there, or medical there, medicine efforts, or debt service for our CIP, or benefit costs assessment, health. And also, again, we just talk about wage growth for government employees, same thing. You hold them flat for maybe 1 year or two. We cannot do that forever. You give people some growth there. Those are the expanded pressure. Just try to provide the same level of services, or to try to answer the needs there. But then on top of that, there's a lot of other needs there. No matter state education, we heard about the requests from the school system there. Public safety, I mean, as the population community needs, public safety and that. Senior citizens, we just heard the report last time on demographic trends in the next 2 years, doubling the population. So there will be more and more need to that as well. And the snow removal, you got to think, why is not applaud after 2 days? And then DPW come back, say, last year you froze so many positions just to make ends meet there. I mean, what can I do about that now? So when things improve there, we would, you know, in a normal year, like 7, you know, close to a new normal year, we need to at least free up at least small portion of the frozen positions to cope with system needs, and all those need money. And road resurfacing, historically, the county for multiple years have a lots of fund balance at the end of the year when the economy was good, the growth was good, and you can realize some of this or a large portion of that for some are for one-time operating initiative, but other times you need to have because of the road services and that's touch on different communities. Now that money has been dwindling. We have very little money left at the end of the year.
That started back in, by the way, that started back in the mid-90s. We started going to pay-go. But if you look at the mid-90s, while we had a real estate recession in the early 90s, we've had that pretty good growth period in terms of the county growing with available land and commercial development and home building over a sustained period of time, which is now leveling out. So pay-go work, pay-go may not work as well in the future.
And in the future, if the fund balance is not available as needed, or then going forward, and sometimes we may have to even budget from the annual revenue boost a proportion to deal with those CIP issues. Because like the resourcing nowadays, we cannot fund it, it's not going to do that. So we're just saying there was a lot of things, so it's continue to be a challenge for the government and just for the community as well. We have to balance all the needs, the tax burden, and also the sustainability on that. And at the end of the day, I think we all have to find a way just to live within our needs, but also the challenge and also the demand, and try to get the best result from the money we invest. So, one question, I'll leave it for our finance folks on debt.
On the pay-go, pay-go really, I mean, well, let's see, fund balance, pay-go from fund balance. Fund balance really for us represents at the end of the year the rounding error on our ability to accurately forecast spending and revenues. It's unlikely that if we come up short on fund balance, it's because our projections suffered during the course of the year. Last year was a good example. But only close to $2 billion budget, you're not going to nail it, right? And so that $10 to $15 million cushion, if you will, and it's not really a plan cushion, it's just the nature of the way in which we project, should always be there. I mean, if it isn't, something's happened in the course of the year that's don't fit.
And one thing I think is good, and you would say that this kind of policy is, if there's a policy that any fund balance here, you can only use for one time, non-recurring capital costs, which is very good to protect us, otherwise we feed ourselves with future risks. Only for finance talk about debt, because that's another very important subject.
Okay, we've got 15 minutes for 30 minutes. So, well, as we look at the metrics, we've been through this once before, right, Holly? So this is just to refresh us, and then I think we start moving into talking about the recommendations. Two major recommendations: borrowing and spending, and then the framing of it, which I think is as important as the recommendations relative to what we want to happen within the county, within the council and the county executives, the conversations and communication to the citizens as to where we are and how we need to approach it. So we start communicating versus, I'll use the example in the state level, all of a sudden we had a rain tax because we didn't articulate for a period of 5 to 10 years what the issues were that we need to be talking about, which actually was in the original environmental sustainability committee in the county. It was actually in there. We didn't do it because from a political standpoint, we tend to stay in the moment. Our recommendations are as much as we can to try to get people out of the moment and into talking about where we are and where we're going. Okay?
Good morning, my name is Nikki Griffith, I'm in the Department of Finance and I manage the county's debt portfolio. So these are the topics that we're gonna cover, the debt measures which we looked at previously. We're gonna compare ourselves to other Maryland counties. Another topic is the amount of bonds that have been authorized previously but remain unissued. And then projections for what the measures might look like in the future. So first is the 4 county debt affordability measures. The first one is outstanding debt as a percent of the assessable base. The county's charter limits that to 4.8%. And so you can see from 2014 to 2015, the assessable base grew, but also the amount of general obligation debt outstanding grew, and the ratio did increase slightly to 2.34% as of the end of FY15. Measure number 2 is the debt measured against the population on a per capita basis, and we base our measures on rating criteria from Moody's and some of the other credit rating agencies. So the per capita debt exceeding 1,200 is sort of an area where the rating agencies give you a second look, start having concerns. So you can see from 2014 to 2015, our population grew, again, that debt grew, and so our debt per capita did increase to 35, a little over 3,500 per capita.
And one thing to go back to, sorry, the first measure, the county's 2.3%, as a part of the assessable base there, we're still under the county's statutory limit on there. But if you look at some other counties like Baltimore City, Prince George County, their policy is cannot exceed either 2% or 2.2% assessable base. So we're actually kind of, if their standard, we're going to be
So the third measure is then the per capita debt measured as a percent of per capita income. And a limit of 10% is consistent with other AAA rated counties, which is the highest rating that we can receive. And the per capita income, the latest we had was for 2014, we don't quite have 2015 yet. But you can see that the ratio maintained at 4.5%. And this is part of why the rating agencies don't consider our per capita debt quite as concerning, because the incomes in the county are so high. So when you do the calculations, it's a lower per capita income level. And then if we go to measure 4, that's the debt service as a percent of current revenues. The goal is to keep it below 10% here in the county. And so you can see that when we factor in the revenues from the general fund and the fire and rescue fund and environmental services fund, the debt service actually decreased to 8.84% of revenues in FY15. And measure number 4 is an indication of the general fund's capacity to address other priorities within the county. So we try to keep it at a lower level. And here's where Holly was mentioning that we're comparing ourselves to other counties. You can see debt as a percent of assessable base. Ours is over 2%, and she mentioned what we're going to get to later is that some of the other counties maintain theirs below 2%. And then, as we had already discussed, the debt per capita is slightly higher for the county than the surrounding jurisdictions.
I wouldn't call that slightly.
And then debt as a percent of personal income, there we're a little closer to PG County and Baltimore County. And then the debt service as a percent of revenue, we are higher. Some of the other jurisdictions limit it to 8% as opposed to the 10% that we have. So then we broke out the amount of authorized bonds that are unissued for the different categories. So the top, starting with water and sewer bonds, these are ones that are, these are bonds that are paid for by revenues outside of the general fund. We have other dedicated revenues to pay the debt service for those. So the water and sewer bonds, we still have 385 million. And a lot of times that's because we have huge projects that get authorized so that they can do the projects, and we have to authorize the bonds at the same time we authorize the expenditures. So we haven't been tapping into Maryland water quality bonds, but we still have authorization to use that if that is a better way for us to finance some of our water projects. And then the building excise tax, that supports bonds for new roads. And then we also have the authorization for tax increment bonds if one of those shall come through. And then we also have broadband fees that we are beginning to collect, and there's an authorization for bonds. We do intend to issue bonds for that in March.
So there's about $1 billion worth of authorized and unissued bonds in total in all the different categories?
Correct.
And those have been issued. How over what period of time were those authorized? Like, are those just a accumulation of authorizations over the last 10 or 15 years? They just haven't been spent?
Right. The way it works is our bond authorizations, they lapse after 4 years unless we reauthorize. And so when we do the adopted capital budget, we go through and determine whether or not reauthorizations are needed. If the project's done, if they...
Does that mean they get put back into the new capital budget though?
It remains in the budget, and then we're just reauthorizing the amount of unissued bonds if it's still needed, because there can be adjustments to the capital project costs.
The, if I could take the geo bonds as an example, I think throughout the years there's a lot of things going on. Some of it's just timing, because when you authorize a project and you have to close the contract, etc., you have to put the money there, but it might take 3 years to get it finished there. And you do line of credit, and then you issue bond for that. So it's probably get spread in the next several years. So that's why that's part of the reason. But there are other times that's because the timing. This project is originally it was a priority, but it's less priority. Probably just hold it for a little while and then come back on that. And there are other times that at some point it dropped, the actual cost of change there. Then you have to close that. Then the original authorized account. The proportion we will off. And then they will free up the money and go back, then we'll reduce. So there's multiple reasons.
Right, and I will say that the county's policy is to use all other revenue sources before we issue bonds, because we want to minimize the amount of bonds that we issue. So that's another reason why that drags on longer.
Yeah. But also another thing, we are actually, Alan was talking to us the other day, we need to take a closer look at historical authorized an issue there down the road. It's kind of very tedious to do that. We are, taking that.
I imagine at the time you would have enough data on the second algorithm to know what's coming.
Yes, one thing is that those ones actually, if the majority of them eventually get issued, these are taking future debt capacity. Then at that point you have very limited. And that's part of the concern last year that, the committee say, let's bring it back to 90 at that point, because the past several years, we get 120, 120. We haven't issued yet, but then at some point, we're gonna use that future capacity there. So these all, not immediately or one-on-one, but they all transfer to.
Which is why we look at the potential, the portion versus revenue in the out years.
So this next slide shows the general obligation bond authorizations from 2000 all the way through 2015. And then we compare it to the amount that was issued in each of those years. So you can see that some years, as you mentioned, because they were authorized but unissued, you actually issue more than is authorized for the single year. But overall, the average year amount issued was 68 million. Or 85% of the authorized amount.
Yes.
Do you guys have a
hidden column that has a probability of authorized but unissued but will be likely issued column? Is that the column we're talking about?
I do not have a secret column, I like them.
Because that's,
But that's the exercise that we're gonna
and
do.
then that would be the and you also have a hidden cumulative column. So per year, you have the probability of that specific year's authorization that's gonna come through per year. And then you have a cumulative of all of those. So then we have an idea of what we're facing. We all have an idea.
Right, right,
You guys.
right. And that's the exercise we're gonna go through in conjunction with the project managers to determine how the project
And
will.
what's the, just get a sense relative to what we're doing of the time frame for getting that done.
It's going to take us a while. It's unlikely that we'd have the results of this in time for it to have a meaningful impact on spending affordability. How I indicated, Alan, is look at long-term practice in the county. Sometimes pushing projects out into later years, that and continuing to push those projects out to later years. The need is to say, no, we're not going to do this rather than push those out. Kicking the can down the road. And so there's a part of this that represents such projects that may never need to be done, and that's going to take a lengthy process to sit down and look at those. There are equally projects that may be in our capital program that are largely completed but hadn't been closed yet. We don't want to be confused by those. We want to include those. So it's a project by project look, but not just at the current year, looking at several years worth of history to see is this project continuing to be kicked down the road.
But it sounds like from the perspective of this committee, Stan, that as we may make a recommendation relative to at least improving the capital process in terms of 5 years,
Sure.
5 years, this seems like that fits into it to get a better handle on managing our business.
It does, and for us to have a meaningful number, we really look, we should look down. Because I think the takeaway from the numbers that Nikki and Holly and I did talk about this yesterday, is that we not hold ourselves and say, we can recommend a higher amount because we don't appear to issue that higher amount.
Yeah, right.
It could eventually be issued, so we need to be, we need to recommend what's affordable to us and recognize that we may spend every cent of that, although over a few year period.
I think until the county and we all get a better handle on that, we have to assume.
Yes, yes, sir.
It would be wrong not to assume that. Okay.
So, then we decided to, project out what the debt measures might be based on some assumed levels of authorizations and issuances in future years. So we, chose to use 85 million, 90 million, 95, and 100 million. And then you can see how the debt outstanding, would grow based on each of those annual issuance amounts from FY 16 through FY 2021. So you can see that actually if we reduced our issuances to 85 million from the 95 million we've done in the past few years, the debt outstanding per assessable base would actually decrease to 2.02%. And so if we maintained at 90 or 95 million, those would also be decreasing only if we start issuing 100 million annually with the outstanding debt as a percent of assessable base increase over that period. And then this just graphically shows how that would be affected, the debt as a percent of assessable base over the years.
And so this is what I asked Holly to put this together so we could start looking at what the impact of what we recommend is relative to where we want to head.
What interest rate are you using?
We're using a 4.5% interest rate because we're going all the way out into 2021.
But the only issue with that particular graph is that it doesn't take into account already authorized unissued amounts of $381 million.
I will say that 381 million has been constant for many years. So we don't really.
No, I understand that it's there, and it's, I mean,
Right.
we're only issuing, what was it last year, 90?
We recommended 90, and they
92.
issued, I think you went through 95.
We didn't actually
Authorized.
Authorize the issuance.
We
Some of that was
talked
from
about
some of that,
Issuance, yeah.
some of that was from previous years.
Yeah.
The issuance.
And yeah, you were right,
So at some point you have to say, let's stop, let's, you know, kind of either wipe the slate clean and clear out some of these authorizations if there's not projects, so that we don't,
add-on
because
funds.
you could issue all of those $380 million and not trip any of
These levels, yeah.
covenants, if you want to call them that. Because you'll still be.
Because you would still not be
within-
authorizing it because you can't physically.
You would still be
manage
within
that
all of
year.
the,
But they do wipe them out every 4 years, right?
no, they usually reauthorize them through
They
the.
can, well, that
But
doesn't
they
go
can't.
through.
We can.
They can wipe them out.
But that 300,
We
just,
start
I'm
off
not,
with that
to-
as
this isn't something we can, you know, obviously we don't think about it, but starting with Richard here, we were going through it. That 381 million, if you look at the delta on average, it was about 13 million between authorized and issued. That's 35 years worth of that average, so we're trying to figure out why that number is as big as it is.
Is it responsible? I mean, I'm thinking of it like a timing gap, right? Like it just is what it is and it's about the same. Is that an irresponsible way to look at that number? I mean,
Well, I wouldn't look at it
that's
as,
a little bit.
I think, no, I wouldn't look at it as a timing. I would look at it as we've been authorizing a higher level as a county. The county's been authorizing a higher level than we've been spending, and that gap has just been growing. So not a timing, say we authorize 100, but we only spend 90, that 10 million isn't a gap, it's just, oh, it's still in the bucket.
And it's not growing, I will say, it's maintained, because
I-
some drops
I
off
understand.
as we.
But it grew to that point, is what I'm saying. It got to that point for whatever reason, and now it's
And I
not.
think the key would be going backwards, looking at it, what's the history of that growing? Was it consistent, or was there a period where it popped up and then leveled? Just, we don't know. And I think you need, that's where you look at the data and see where the data takes you. To see if there's a recommendation, maybe come from the executive and the council, but is there a recommendation in there in terms of how we do business?
Yeah, I think there could be. We want to think about it.
Quick question. Would the premium reduce, is that one of the factors that reduce what we issue?
Yeah, but marginally. I mean, it does have an impact. If we sell 75 million, the actual cost to us may be 72 million if we get a premium for this. So it does have an impact, but it offsets some of those costs.
Are you retiring bonds this year?
We are, yes, every year. That we try to maintain level debt service throughout the foreseeable future. But yes, every year, and we have a pretty aggressive amortization schedule. That's one of the features that the rating agency gives us. 2 quick points about the authorization process. We don't authorize bonds willy-nilly. We're looking at the capital program every year, and we're authorizing based on we use every available revenue source first, and then we are looking at the need to issue bonds to fund the rest. Now, the issue becomes, are those projects actually constructed? But they are authorized because they're in the capital program, and we're identifying the revenue source for them. We may not spend that authorization, and we may not spend it in that year, but we do authorize because it's in the program. Alan has indicated we've got to change the way we do business. We've got to stop saying yes to worthy capital projects that we may not be able to afford. Just don't keep pushing them down the road. Don't get them in the program to begin with. The other point that I'll make is that our bond issuance is not proscriptive. We spend the money, then we issue bonds and reimburse ourselves. So we're not issuing $100 million worth of bonds and saying, now we got to spend this money. We are only issuing bonds to reimburse ourselves for bond authorized project expenditures in the prior year.
And I think the only reason I'm raising the point, and it's not to say that anybody is doing anything, if it came across, it wasn't intended that at all. It's, if we set this up as something we do as a county going forward, and we're always doing it, when the people who are doing it prudently today aren't here doing it, it's still going to be there. So it's kind of like, make sure it's set up so that we don't allow those things that they can happen.
It's why you negotiate a contract, so that the people who aren't around the table know what.
So what Alan's saying makes sense, you know, let's just stop getting the stuff that shouldn't be in there in the process.
Say no, if you're going to have to say no up front as opposed to.
Rather than just pushing it down the road.
Absolutely.
And the council just, there was a bill just passed that the council put in that's required the administration to show actual numbers in the out years for every year, which hasn't been done in the past. And so the program has had really inflated numbers, but it just hasn't been presented to show it. And this year you're going to see those numbers. So some years they had like $300 million worth of bonds that was in the program, and obviously that's not realistic.
I agree with what Craig just said, we talk at our first meeting this year, like when we talk about the picture, show the multi-year CIP plan, how this county is outlier compared to other counties. The immediate fiscal year is fine, and then going forward, it's a few times of the year, immediate fiscal year, so that's not true fiscal planning when we talk about CIP, and has been probably a tradition for a while, but doesn't mean that's the way we should do it. If we do the realistic budgeting and then make sense down the road, rather than try to kick the can down the road, we do have to make some more dramatic changes.
When you're doing the CIP plan, are you also planning the operating expenditures going forward for those particular projects?
Yeah, when we actually.
And what that increase of spending will be on projects that are done today, so
Yeah.
that
We're also working with agencies this year in recognition that, and try to let us know what's the operating impact for those CIP program on that. 'Cause that's reflected debt service, but also there's staff up costs, there are people managing that.
that's a,
Like the college or the
Yeah.
schools, that's all.
And that needs to be accounted for too.
yeah, that's the expense. I mean, the debt service will go away because we haven't aggressive, but that expense will always be there and always grow.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we also did projections of what the debt service would be in the out years based on the 4 different issuance levels. And really, the debt service as a percent of revenue is for all agencies, is the one that's more critical. That one tends to be where we're butting up against our caps more often. So you can see between the 85 million to the 100 million out in the out years, there's over a $5 million difference there in the annual debt service. And if you go to the peak years, if we go to 100 million, if the peak year is out here in FY19 versus if we limit to 85 million, it's going to peak this fiscal year.
So basically, if you go to fiscal 21, it's out 15 basis points per year for a $5 million increase.
And then here we're just showing
I
graphically.
just had one point, just to remind the group, we added the fire tax in last year. Fire tax hadn't been part of this metric. So without the fire tax in here, we'd be above the 10.
Yeah, if we just look at general fund, there's a lot of other kind of under the general fund, we are already over 10% at this point. So we're putting fire tax in the base because that's also a legitimate, that's actually the source of funding, part of the.
And other counties don't have fire taxes, so it's already in there.
It was not, that wasn't a gimmick. That
No,
was a
no, no,
recognition
what-
of reality.
Right, I worked at the state treasurer's office, and the way that we did our metric, although we limited it to 8%, was that we did factor in all the other dedicated revenues sources that pay for the debt.
Just a quick question, don't need an answer now, but is the same kind of modeling that they're considering on this issue that applied to the water and sewer bonds area?
Yes, we would do it for all.
So we have some clarity there as to whether there's a growing issue or problem?
So again, this is just graphically shown, so it's on the previous page. And then here's the actual, what some of the other surrounding jurisdictions do as far as their debt measures. And in the state of Maryland, the debt outstanding is not to exceed 4% of state personal income because their income tax is the property tax is much lower than what we're collecting here. But their property tax is completely dedicated to paying debt service. It's put in a separate fund. And just in the past few years, they've had to start dipping into the general fund to cover their debt service because it's exceeding what the property tax revenues is.
And to refresh your memory, that the county state account is 4.5%. Last year, debt service is 9 years old.
So then you can just see the comparison of Anne Arundel County limits to 3% of personal income. And then as far as assessable base, Prince George's County is 2%, Baltimore County is 2.2%.
Are we more like Montgomery County that's not on there, or are we more like Anne Arundel County that is on there?
Montgomery County, they don't issue very many general obligation bonds at all because they issue through the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission for their water bonds, and then also through the park. Right, so they have separate entities that issue the majority of their bonds. So theirs would be very low. It's not a,
Is that why they worded it comparable?
yes, exactly. It's not, yeah.
I was wondering.
Thank you. Okay. We're gonna get out of here on 9:15, which is an improvement on last week. Let's look at the positive side of that. Next week, we're gonna focus on recommendations. So look at this. And relatively look at it to both from the standpoint of the key metric, which is what we're gonna recommend borrowing, what we're gonna recommend spending, and then really think about what we've talked about from business issues. You can look at last year's report, it's not a bad thing to look at where we're making recommendations. Look at things where we can make recommendations to the county relative to how we run our business. And to discussions that we may believe are helpful for the county, from the executive to the council, to have with our citizens. To start talking about the right things, so it's not, we try to take it out of the political realm and into what makes sense. Remember I said at the beginning, our main goal is common sense and conversation in what we do, and that's where our recommendations should be based on. Okay, and I think I want to thank Holly and your team for putting together this presentation today. Finances. We have, one thing that we learned last year, for those of us that it was our first year, and something that we have really, I learned this through the transition team actually 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago. We have really good, high-quality people working for the county. They care about what they do. We have great information. They've been, I can't think of, even for, Chief Butler, very open in listening to us and allowing us to listen to them. And that's as great an asset as the county has. So what we want to do is now bring that citizens' common sense back to see what we think is appropriate relative to the world that we're living in now and perceive to live in the next at least 5 to 10 years. And then we'll take what we do next week and we'll probably fine tune it with a smaller group to get an actual written report back to you so we can then present it to the county executive, and then we will also present it to the council, and a group that does that. You okay? Yeah, well, I'm heading to New Jersey. Okay. Thank you all.